there are wildlands where nature still keeps some of America's strangest secrets. The Colorado Plateau. Cliff dwellings cut directly into the rock, 140 feet above the canyon floor. 5-story stone cities rising in canyons with no permanent water. Doorways aligned with the sun. A village reachable only by foot, mule or helicopter. Where mail still arrives by mule train. How do you raise a child in a home you reach by climbing 140 feet of wood every day? How do you build a 5-story city in a desert with no water, hauling every beam 60 miles in on foot, with no wheels and no pack animals? And how does an entire civilization quietly walk out, leave everything intact, and never come back, without anyone explaining why? From the cliff dwellings to the stone cities, from the heirloom orchards to the canyons where families never left, every answer is here. This is the Colorado Plateau, the part of America with its own laws, its own languages, and unsolved disappearances no one can explain. And the deeper you go, the less of it makes sense. Bryce Canyon isn't actually a canyon at all. It's a row of bowl-shaped amphitheatres scooped out of the edge of a high plateau. Sitting nearly 2 miles above sea level, the park sees something most desert places never do. More than 200 freeze-thaw cycles a year, where water sneaks into cracks, freezes overnight, and quietly pries the rock apart. This slow chipping is what builds Hoodoos, and Bryce holds tens of thousands of them packed into a single park. What's strange is that the same park can hit 90 degrees in the afternoon and drop below freezing the same night, so the sculpting never really stops. On a clear night, the air is so clean and thin that visitors can count more stars overhead with the naked eye, which is why Bryce became one of the country's first official dark sky parks. That same thin air carries sound in odd ways too, so a whispered conversation across an amphitheatre can be heard on the other side as if the speaker was standing right next to you. Long before tourists arrived, the Paiute people lived near this plateau and didn't romanticise the Hoodoos at all. They believed the Spires were a race called the Legend People, turned to stone as punishment and frozen in place forever. It sounds crazy, but Hoodoos grow at just 1 inch every 50 to 65 years, meaning the spires standing today took longer to form than any human civilization, and the ones rising right now across this basin won't be finished for thousands of years to come. Walking into the Bryce Amphitheatre feels like stepping into a city built by the wrong architect. thousands of spires crowd together, some no wider than a person, others taller than a 20-story building. Those colours aren't an accident. Iron and manganese minerals baked into the rock give the Hoodoos their red, orange and white bands, and each stripe marks a different chapter of what this place once was. One of the most famous spires, Thor's Hammer, balances a massive flat-top boulder on a thin column of rock. Honestly, it's only a matter of time before the neck wears through and the whole thing collapses. Drop down the Navajo Loop Trail and you end up hundreds of feet below the rim, eye level with formations that looked small from above, but turn out to be the size of office buildings. Believe it or not, a single firm hand grip can crack the top of a hoodoo, which is why touching them is illegal. Down at ground level, the broken terrain creates a network of shaded corridors and open clearings, exactly the kind of broken, sheltered terrain that small burrowing animals find irresistible, especially the Utah prairie dogs. Among those clearings, they've turned this rough terrain into one of its last strongholds, found only at a handful of high elevation sites in the southwest. Their burrows run like a subway beneath the meadows, with separate chambers for sleeping, pups and waste. You wouldn't expect it, but their calls aren't simple alarms. Each bark describes the predator's size, colour and speed. They're a keystone species too. Their burrows shelter owls and snakes, and their grazing keeps the grass short enough for other animals to spot danger. Sadly, eagles, badgers and coyotes target them constantly, which is why towns post rotating lookouts while the rest feed. That same mix of open ground and constant watchfulness draws in a very different kind of opportunist, the golden-mantled ground squirrel, which has figured out that where prairie dogs keep the grass short and the predators busy, life gets a whole lot easier. Unlike the prairie dog with its endless social duties, the squirrel is a solo operator, with no colony, no lookouts, no alarm system, just one small animal relying on its own wits. It looks a lot like a chipmunk, but it's much larger and has no stripes on its face, a difference that confuses visitors constantly. That confusion suits the squirrel just fine when there's a tourist snack bag nearby. Before winter hits this elevation, it spends weeks gorging and stuffing its cheek pouches until they balloon to 3 times the size of its head, then hibernates for months with its heart rate dropping to just a few beats per minute. That same instinct to survive by reading the land is exactly what drew humans to this plateau region long ago. Nowhere is that story clearer than at Bandelier, where people didn't just live near the rock, they made their homes directly into it. Humans read this terrain the same way the squirrel did, as a place worth staying. In Frijoles Canyon, the ancestral Pueblo people didn't just settle here. They carved their homes directly into the canyon walls, using nothing more than sharpened stones and digging sticks. The rock they shaped is called tuff, soft enough to hollow out by hand, which is why over 1,000 rooms still line the walls today, some with original plaster still intact. One of those dwellings' alcove house sits 140 feet above the canyon floor, reachable only by wooden ladders, a climb every resident, including children and elders, made as part of daily life. What made all of this possible was water, a small but permanent stream running through the canyon, one of the only reliable sources in this stretch of plateau, and whoever controlled it had something the entire region desperately wanted. These communities didn't vanish. Their descendants still live in Pueblo villages along the Rio Grande today, and many consider this site a living, ancestral home, not a ruin. The cliff rooms at Bandelier hint at something ambitious, but a few hours northwest, the ancestral Puebloans built on a scale that still doesn't make sense. A massive stone complex in a remote desert canyon with no permanent water nearby. The largest structure alone once rose 4 or 5 stories tall with around 650 rooms, more than most people could ever build without modern tools. Hundreds of thousands of wooden beams were hauled from forests over 60 miles away. On foot, no wheels, no pack animals. Size was only half of it. Doorways and windows were precisely aligned to mark the exact moment of solstices and equinoxes, turning the whole canyon into a working astronomical calendar. Straight engineered roads stretched outward for hundreds of miles, connecting the site to dozens of smaller communities. Despite all of this, the population here was probably never that large. Researchers now believe it was a ceremonial hub, a place people travelled to rather than lived in. At some point, everyone simply left, and nobody knows exactly why, though the roads are still visible from the air, and every astronomical alignment still works perfectly. And while looking for the same coordinated the original inhabitants were, you'll see a single peak splitting the flat horizon called Shiprock. What you're actually looking at is the frozen core of a volcano. Magma hardened inside the vent long ago, while everything softer around it slowly eroded, leaving this impossible-looking spike of rock standing alone on the plain. Strangely enough, the rock itself formed roughly 3,000 feet underground, meaning the desert floor has dropped that much since the volcano existed. Radiating from the base are long wall-like ridges of rock called dikes, 7 of them, that stretch across the desert like the roots of a tree, with some running for several miles and giving the whole formation the look of a cracked star from above. To the Navajo, this is Tse Bit Ai, rock with wings, and their stories describe it as a great bird that carried their ancestors to safety during a time of crisis, which is why the formation is considered sacred and off-limits to outsiders. Climbing it was once popular enough to be listed in a book called 50 Classic Climbs of North America. But after a fatal accident in 1970 and growing tension over the violation of sacred land, the Navajo Nation banned all climbing, and that ban has held ever since. can't hike to it, camp near it, or even drive the dirt road that leads toward it. Visitors are expected to view it from the highway, which somehow makes the formation feel more powerful, not less. That same respect extends to Mesa Verde, where the ancestral Puebloans didn't just live near the rock, they built entire cities inside it. Over 600 cliff dwellings are packed into a single mesa here, ranging from single rooms to multi-story complexes. Cliff Palace, the largest cliff dwelling in North America, contains over 150 rooms and more than 20 kivas, circular underground chambers used for ceremonies, all packed into a single, natural alcove in the canyon wall. The ancestral Puebloans lived on the mesa top for centuries before moving into the cliffs, suggesting the shift wasn't slow exploration, but a deliberate choice, possibly driven by a threat history hasn't fully identified. The structures were built without modern mortar. Builders used a mix of soil, water and ash to bind the stones, and that combination has held together so well that some walls still stand exactly as they were left. Every room had a purpose, some for sleeping, some for storage, some for grinding corn, and the doorways were built small and T-shaped, a design that may have made them easier to block or defend, though no one is entirely sure why. Then, after generations of building and community, the entire population walked away and never returned, making it one of the great unsolved mysteries of the Southwest. Their descendants still live in Pueblo communities across New Mexico and Arizona. Many still consider Mesa Verde not an abandoned ruin, but a place their families simply moved on from, which changes how you look at every empty doorway. Moab is a desert river town that somehow became one of the most filmed, mined, and mythologized places in the Southwest. Long before tourists arrived, the ground here was hiding something far more valuable than scenery. Uranium sat in massive quantities just below the desert floor, turning a quiet town into the uranium capital of the world almost overnight. Hundreds of prospectors flooded in, and fortunes were made in weeks. The boom was real, but so was the cost, which most people didn't discover until long after the money was gone. Sadly, at least 600 miners eventually died from radiation-related illness. The leftover radioactive waste was quietly used as construction fill around town, ending up under roads, under buildings, and even under a school for years before anyone raised an alarm. Hollywood arrived at roughly the same time, and the red rock terrain has since doubled as outer space, alien planets, and the American frontier in dozens of major films. The Colorado River shaped every one of these canyons for an unimaginably long time, a timeline so long it makes the uranium boom feel like a blink. The canyon walls are also covered in petroglyphs, left by people who predate even the ancestral Puebloans. Some are so old that modern indigenous communities aren't certain who made them. Above it all, the mesas rise flat-topped and indifferent to everything below. None watches the valley more sharply than the one rising just outside town. Prairie Mesa stands nearly 1,000 feet straight from the desert floor, with walls so sheer there's no obvious route up from any direction. This formation looks unclimbable from every angle, and for most of its existence it was. No trail, no path, no obvious way up. The only route requires scrambling up exposed ledges, where a single wrong step means a fall with no recovery, which is why most visitors just stare at it from the road. Up top, the summit is completely flat and almost entirely undisturbed. Desert grasses and cryptobiotic soil crust still grow exactly as they have for generations, simply because so few people ever make it there. That crust is one of the most fragile living surfaces on Earth, holding the desert together through a paper-thin layer of organisms that takes over a century to recover from a single footprint. The view from the top stretches across arches, canyonlands, and the entire Colorado River corridor at once, a layout that makes it easy to see why this terrain kept pulling people back for centuries. Look a few miles east and something rises alone from the desert floor. Castleton Tower is one of the most climbed desert towers in the southwest. Yet the standard route still demands technical rope work on near vertical rock, with exposure so severe that even experienced climbers describe the final pitch as genuinely unsettling. The sandstone looks solid from a distance, but is honeycombed with tiny fractures. Handholds that feel secure can simply break off without warning. It sounds crazy, but the summit is barely the size of a large dining table. Once a climbing team arrives, everyone just stands there, hundreds of feet above the desert, trying not to think too hard about that. Ravens nest on the upper ledges year-round and regularly fly close enough to touch, apparently unbothered by the humans clinging to their tower. The tower has appeared in enough films and advertisements that many people recognise it without knowing its name. Used to sell everything from trucks to survival gear. Geologists know the summit is slowly shifting too, as natural fracturing reshapes the top little by little, each decade leaving it slightly different from the last. Past Castleton, the road reaches a cliff face, with a dirt track scraped directly into it, dropping hundreds of feet in tight switchbacks known as the Moki Dugway. The road doesn't warn you, it just arrives at the edge of Cedar Mesa and drops, a dirt track scraped into a cliff face, with nothing between your tyres and a 1,100 foot fall, but loose gravel. This route was never meant for tourists. It was cut into the Mesa to haul uranium ore down from the plateau, which is why it's unpaved, unguarded, and barely wide enough for one vehicle. The switchbacks are so tight that large vehicles must perform multi-point turns mid-cliff, a manoeuvre most drivers don't realise is coming until they're already in it. No guardrails line most of the descent, just open air and the kind of drop that makes passengers stare at the floor and grip whatever's closest. You wouldn't expect it, but the road is completely open to any driver, any vehicle, with no permit and no ranger check. Just a small sign at the top. That sign is the last thing you read before the desert takes over. And waiting at the bottom is a rock that looks like it was placed there as a prank. Mexican Hat's literally a 60-foot sandstone disc, balanced on a narrow pedestal. It's tilted at an angle that makes it look moments from falling, yet it has sat exactly like that longer than anyone has been around to watch. The pedestal is softer rock than the cap above, so it erodes faster. The hat is slowly losing its stand, and one day it will topple with no warning. The desert offers something even harder to believe. Over 2,000 natural stone arches sit packed into a single park, proof that erosion, given enough time, is a surprisingly good sculptor. Arches National Park is the product of a geological process so slow and so specific that it only works here. It's not a coincidence. A layer of salt buried underground is slowly dissolving, causing the rock above to crack, shift, and hollow out, and that process hasn't stopped. New arches are still forming right now, existing ones are still collapsing, and the park looks slightly different every decade. One arch stretches over 290 feet across, but is only a few feet thick in places, already unstable enough that a large chunk fell without warning during an ordinary afternoon while hikers watched. In summer, the rock surface regularly hits 150 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to burn bare skin and drain a person of water fast enough to turn a short hike into a rescue situation. The park's most photographed arch sits at the open edge of a canyon, with nothing behind it but sky, a detail that surprises almost every first-time visitor who expected something more sheltered. The entire park also sits on an active salt anticline, meaning the ground is technically still moving, slowly, but enough that the whole formation field is shifting over geological time. That same warm sandstone draws in one group of desert survivors who have turned doing almost nothing into a serious survival strategy. Reptiles here just press themselves flat against the hot rock and let the sun do the work. The spiny lizard is so well matched to this terrain that it practically disappears against the rock. Its keeled scales aren't decorative. They reduce water loss in a desert where shade is rare and heat can kill within hours. A design so efficient it needs almost no water intake compared to animals of its size. Rather than chase prey, it sits completely still and lets insects come to it, a hunting strategy that burns almost no energy and works surprisingly well when the temperature does half the work. Males perform push-ups on prominent rock surfaces to signal dominance, which sounds ridiculous until you realise it works. Rivals read the display from a distance and frequently back down without a fight. What's strange is that females can store sperm for months after mating, delaying fertilisation until conditions are right, a level of reproductive control most reptiles simply don't have. Hawks, roadrunners and larger lizards hunt them constantly, so a spiny lizard's entire day runs on one precise calculation: stay warm enough to move fast, but stay still enough not to be seen. Survival here is all about defying the odds, and nearby, the balanced rock is doing exactly that. The whole structure stands 128 feet tall, with the boulder on top roughly the size of 3 school buses stacked together, all resting on a column of softer rock that erodes a little more every year. That pedestal wears away faster than the cap above it, so the gap between balancing precariously and collapsed on the ground is closing, just too slowly for any human to ever witness. A smaller companion boulder that once sat nearby already fell, leaving only a stump, a quiet preview of what's eventually coming for the main act. Not every formation here has the luxury of a pedestal. One stands on 2 legs alone, at the very edge of a drop. Delicate arch survives on something closer to luck, a 65-foot loop of sandstone standing completely alone at a canyon rim with nothing supporting it but its own 2 legs. Reaching it requires a 3-mile round-trip hike across open slick rock in full sun. No shade, no guardrails, and a canyon drop at the edge, which surprises most visitors who expect a roadside view. It sounds crazy, but early settlers considered it so unremarkable they nicknamed it the Schoolmarm's Bloomers, the same arch that now appears on Utah's license plate and draws visitors from across the world. Below it sits a natural rock bowl that collects rainwater, one of the few reliable water sources in the area, quietly drawing desert wildlife to the base of the arch after every storm. In winter, snow settles across the red rock and transforms the whole scene into something almost unrecognisable, a version most visitors never see, and that photographs look too dramatic to be real. Another arch extends to a scale that makes this one look modest. It's longer, thinner, and by geologists' own reckoning, far closer to the end. Called landscape, it survives on stubbornness, spanning 290 feet across to become one of the longest natural arches on Earth, yet thinning in the middle to a ribbon barely 6 feet thick. It looks less like geology and more like something that forgot to finish collapsing. And it is collapsing, just slowly enough that each visitor has no idea how different it looked a decade ago. In the early 1990s, a slab roughly the size of a bus fell from the underside without warning while hikers stood nearby. After that, the trail beneath it was permanently closed. Geologists consider it one of the most structurally compromised arches in the park, meaning every photo taken today may eventually become a record of something that no longer exists. When the sun drops and that wind picks up, the stored heat bleeds back into the cooling air. That's exactly when the desert's smallest hunters slip out of their dens, stepping into a night that belongs entirely to them. The kit fox is the lightest wild canid in North America, built for a desert that would overwhelm almost anything its size. Those oversized ears aren't decorative. They act as radiators, releasing body heat and keeping the fox cool enough to hunt through the night without losing dangerous amounts of water. It gets almost all the moisture it needs from its prey, rarely drinking standing water, making it one of the few predators here that doesn't depend on a water source to survive. A kit fox can hear a mouse moving under the sand from several feet away and pinpoint it precisely before pouncing, a method so accurate it works on moonless nights with zero visibility. Mated pairs share a den, but hunt each night separately, covering different sections of territory so they don't compete with each other for the same food. Coyotes are their main threat, and the fox responds not with speed, but with a network of backup dens. If chased, it simply vanishes underground before the coyote gets close enough to matter. While the fox works the surface, something far smaller is running an equally serious operation below it. Red harvester ants move seeds underground in columns so organised that they look less like insects and more like a logistics crew that never takes a day off. They've been at it since before sunrise, running columns so precise and consistent they wear visible trails into the soil. Each one carries a seed heavier than its own body weight back to an underground granary the colony has been stocking for years, a food reserve that outlasts droughts that kill far larger animals. They don't collect randomly. Scouts identify the most nutritious seeds available and adjust harvesting routes accordingly, a level of collective decision-making that still puzzles researchers. Their mounds ventilate the colony, regulate underground temperature, and loosen compacted desert soil, making it easier for plants to grow and quietly feeding everything above them. You wouldn't expect it, but horned lizards depend almost entirely on these ants for food, meaning the entire local lizard population tracks directly to wherever the colonies are thriving. Nowhere does that shift feel more dramatic than at a small town sitting on the edge of the Colorado Plateau. Page was a construction camp before it was a town, built on land leased from the Navajo Nation to support the Glen Canyon Dam project, and when the work finished, it simply stayed. The dam it served flooded one of the most extraordinary canyon systems ever documented, Glen Canyon, before most of the world knew what was being lost, a decision that still generates fierce debate today. What's strange is that this remote desert outpost now draws millions of visitors a year, almost entirely because the two most photographed slot canyons on Earth, Upper and Lower Antelope Canyon, sit just minutes away. Just beyond town, the reservoir the dam created extends nearly 200 miles into canyon country. Lake Powell took 17 years to fill after the dam closed its gates, and even at full capacity, it covers 96 canyons that most people have no idea are sitting beneath them. First-time visitors regularly get lost between those canyons. Each one looks nearly identical from the water, and there are no road signs out here. The original canyon system is still down there, submerged, drowned alcoves, sunken plateaus, and the ghost of Glen Canyon, a place those who saw it before the flooding still describe with grief. Houseboat culture here is something else entirely. Thousands of people anchor floating homes in private coves for weeks at a time, with canyon walls as a windbreak. Some are fully furnished with air conditioning, kitchens and multiple decks. A house that happens to be drifting in the middle of the desert. The reservoir is also shrinking. Decades of drought have dropped the water level so dramatically that cliff faces not seen in over half a century are re-emerging from the surface. Along those reappearing shorelines, one bird has quietly claimed the territory, the great blue heron, patient enough to outlast almost anything the desert throws at it. It stands so still that passing boaters regularly mistake it for a statue, which is exactly the point. Hunting entirely through patience, it waits until a fish swims within range, then strikes faster than the human eye can follow. What's strange is that it swallows prey whole. Its flexible neck lets it take down animals far larger than its beak suggests it should handle. Despite nesting in large communal rookeries, it hunts alone and will aggressively drive off any other heron that enters its stretch of shoreline. The chicks grow fast, ready to leave the nest within 2 months, which is remarkably quick for a bird this size. As water levels keep dropping, fishing spots shift constantly. It adjusts without missing a meal. Not every hunter here waits at the water's edge. The Osprey takes the opposite approach, straight down from the sky. That dive starts well over 100 feet in the air and ends with an impact fast enough to stun a fish on contact. Its toes are reversible, gripping a slippery fish with 2 claws in front and 2 behind, a feature so specific to fish catching that almost no other bird has it. Nostrils seal on impact too. The entire sequence, spot, fold, drop, grip, resurface, happens in about a second. You wouldn't expect it, but ospreys almost always rotate the fish head first after catching it. Less wind drag on the flight back, a behaviour that looks calculated because it is. Some individuals return to the exact same nest at this reservoir season after season, adding sticks each time. Dropping water levels have concentrated fish into shallower areas, making hunting easier, one of the few species quietly benefiting from the drought. Sharing this airspace, though not competing for the same catch, is a bird that doesn't bother diving at all. The bald eagle has a simpler strategy. Wait for someone else to do the work, then take it. It forces an osprey into a mid-air chase, harassing it until the fish is dropped, then snatches the meal before it hits the water. That tactic, stealing food from other animals, makes up a significant portion of its diet near busy fishing grounds like this reservoir. A wingspan of up to 8 feet lets it cover long stretches of open water without flapping once, which suits a bird that prefers to observe before committing. Sadly, it was nearly wiped out, not by hunting but by a pesticide that thinned its eggshells so much they cracked under the weight of the brooding parent. Seeing one here today, watching from a sandstone ledge above the waterline, is a reminder of how recently that almost didn't happen. The water it watches over exists entirely because of one structure downstream, and that structure is also the reason this whole reservoir is here. Before the water rose even a foot, hundreds of archaeological sites sat exposed along the canyon walls. Most were never fully documented before Glen Canyon Dam closed its gates and the reservoir began rising. Built to supply water and power to the southwest, it still does both, though with the reservoir shrinking each decade, how much longer that holds is an open question. It sounds crazy, but the sheer weight of the water pressing against it is enough to warp the surrounding rock, causing measurable shifts in the canyon walls that engineers monitor continuously. The river that exits below is now a completely different river than the one that entered, colder, clearer, and stripped of the sediment that once built sandbars far downstream. That change ran right through the food chain, down to which fish could survive in waters they'd occupied long before this wall of concrete existed. Few engineering projects in this region have sparked more debate. Environmentalists argue the damage was never worth the trade-off, while water managers say the surrounding population simply couldn't exist without it. Monument Valley is what happens when erosion runs on its own schedule, without dams or concrete to stop it. The sandstone buttes spread across here aren't random. They're what remained after softer rock eroded away, leaving only the hardest material standing. Some rise over 1,000 feet from the ground, taller than most skyscrapers, with nothing around them. Many are considered sacred by the Navajo, and certain areas remain permanently off limits to visitors. Hollywood found this place before most travellers did, and the valley's silhouette has appeared in more Western films than almost any other location in the region. That exposure built the mythology, while the Navajo quietly held every decision about the land itself. The whole site operates without federal involvement. Entry fees fund the tribe directly, not a park system. One road nearby frames the whole valley in a single shot, straight and open, with the buttes lined up on the horizon. The view is so recognisable it has its own name. That straight road became world famous after a single film scene placed Forrest Gump stopping his cross-country run right here on Route 163. People still pull over to recreate the shot at what's now called Forrest Gump Point. Standing in the road, buttes on the horizon, nothing else around them. The road runs so flat and straight that the formations at the end of it appear to float like a mirage. No signpost, no parking lot, just asphalt and a view that's been photographed millions of times. Looking up, golden eagles ride warm air rising off the desert floor, scanning the terrain below without a single wing beat. Their vision is sharp enough to pick out movement in the scrub nearly a mile down. That kind of soaring isn't laziness, it's efficiency, letting the birds spend hours in the air without burning more energy than a slow walk. What's strange is it doesn't rely on sight alone. It watches ravens and other scavengers circling below to pinpoint where prey might be hiding. Some hunt in pairs, one bird flushing an animal, out of cover while the other waits to intercept it. Nesting on the sandstone buttes gives them a natural advantage. Ledges sit high enough to keep eggs out of reach of nearly any ground predator. Fiercely territorial, a resident pair will drive off much larger birds that drift too close to their section of sky. They'll also take on prey far bigger than themselves, occasionally targeting young deer when the opportunity presents itself. Of course, not every animal here lives by hunting. Wild horses drift through this open ground in loose groups, with no particular destination and no hurry to get there. Out here there are no corrals, no brands and no owners, just bands of horses that answer to nobody. They aren't native to this land. Their ancestors escaped from Spanish settlers centuries ago and have been running free ever since. A band is led not by the strongest stallion, but by a lead mare. She decides where the group moves, where it drinks, and when it runs. Stallions compete for mares through endurance as much as fighting, sometimes chasing a rival for miles across open terrain. They can cover 20 miles in a single day, just grazing. Not fleeing, not migrating, just eating. You wouldn't expect it, but they're remarkably good at reading dry terrain, locating moisture in creek beds and patches of scrub that most animals would walk straight past. Their hooves break up hard, packed soil as they move, letting rain sink in rather than run straight off. Long before any of this was open range, this desert already had builders, and what they left behind has stood untouched for centuries. What was built at Hovenweep was deliberate. Stone towers placed on an isolated plateau where the only water came from a spring hidden at the bottom of the canyon. Some sit right at the edge of canyon rims, positioned so close to the drop that building them must have required extraordinary nerve. No one fully agrees on what they were for. Theories range from defensive lookouts to astronomical observatories, and the evidence supports both. Several towers have small openings precisely aligned with the sun during solstices and equinoxes, suggesting the builders were tracking the calendar with remarkable accuracy. The site was abandoned relatively quickly, and no clear explanation has ever been found. The structures were simply left standing, intact, in the middle of nowhere. Valley of the Gods carries all of the same geology, without the signage, the entrance fee, or the crowds. It doesn't advertise itself, and that's the only reason most of it is still intact. Covering roughly the same terrain as Monument Valley, the area draws a fraction of the visitors. No tour buses, guardrails, or park rangers. The only road through is unpaved and roughly 17 miles long. In wet weather, it becomes genuinely impassable. Each butte carries a name given by the Navajo, tied to figures from oral tradition, turning the whole valley into an open-air story most visitors walk through without knowing. Long considered sacred ground, the area now sits uncomfortably alongside the off-road tourism that has grown around it. The sandstone is soft enough that tyre tracks can scar the surface for decades, and some damage from early vehicle use is still visible today. Visitors leave with no map, no signage, and no clear sense of what they just drove through. That same quiet has kept Cedar Mesa's cliff dwellings almost entirely undisturbed, still standing exactly where their builders left them. It holds some of the most concentrated cliff dwelling sites in the region, most still unexcavated. The most unusual is the House on Fire ruins, built under a curved sandstone overhang that catches the morning sun at a very specific angle. For a few minutes a day, reflected light hits the upper ledge and the whole structure appears to ignite. Miss that morning window by even an hour and you'd have no idea anything unusual was there at all. The dwellings themselves are remarkably well preserved, storage rooms intact, walls still standing, as if the people who built them walked away one morning and never came back. Out on the open plain below, Pronghorn move with an easy speed that makes everything else look like it's standing still. Something about the open desert seems to suit them perfectly, until you realise they're the second fastest land animal on Earth. Pronghorn can sustain 55 miles per hour for miles at a stretch, which no predator on this continent can match. It sounds crazy, but that speed evolved for a predator that no longer exists. Cheetah-like hunters that died out long ago, leaving the pronghorn essentially over-engineered for the threats it faces today. Their eyes sit wide on the sides of their head, giving them a near 360-degree field of vision with no blind spots. When one spots danger, the white patch on its rump flares out visibly, a silent signal that spreads through the whole group in seconds. They migrate the same seasonal routes year after year, using no landmarks, only memory. But just out of nowhere, they see a shadow circling above them. That shadow, the pronghorn fear from below, belongs to the red-tailed hawk. Its vision is sharp enough to spot a mouse-sized animal from 100 feet up while moving at speed. In my opinion, the strangest thing about it is that the call most people associate with eagles in films is actually theirs. Hollywood borrowed it because it sounds more impressive than the real thing. It doesn't just hunt on the wing, it'll also sit completely still on an exposed post or rock for long stretches, waiting for something below to make a mistake. A mated pair will defend the same nesting territory year after year, refusing to share their hunting grounds even with their own offspring once the young can fly. Most of what it catches down there is a jackrabbit. Those oversized ears act like built-in radiators, pushing heat out of the body so it can stay cool without ever needing shade. When chased, it hits 40 miles per hour and cuts direction so sharply mid-sprint that most predators simply overshoot. Young are born fully furred and alert, ready to move within hours, not days. Despite all of that, they remain one of the most hunted animals in this desert. Their numbers directly sustain every hawk, coyote, and fox in the region. Long before anyone wrote any of this down, the Navajo were already reading it, and they still are. The nation runs its own government, its own courts and its own police, functioning less like a reservation and more like a country embedded within a country. The Navajo Nation covers roughly 27,000 square miles across 3 states, bigger than 10 US states combined. During World War II, the Navajo language was used as a military code, so complex it was never cracked. Weavers traditionally leave a deliberate path, a thin line running from the centre of a rug to its edge, so the maker's energy has a way out when the work is done. Sand paintings used in healing ceremonies take days to complete with coloured mineral powders, then are destroyed the same day they're finished. The calendar is built around the land itself, with seasonal ceremonies timed not to fixed dates, but to the behaviour of plants, animals, and stars. That same relationship with the land shows up in a completely different culture nearby, where settlers turned a volcanic disaster into a reason to stay. Wupatki Pueblo once held over 100 rooms, the largest structure for miles in any direction when people lived here. What's strange is that a ball court was found near the site, a feature tied to Mesoamerican cultures far to the south, suggesting those connections reached much further than most people realise. A nearby volcanic eruption deposited ash across the ground, and that ash trapped moisture, turning otherwise dry land into something people could farm. The disaster, in other words, created the conditions that drew settlers here in the first place. A natural blowhole sits at the base of the Pueblo, pushing air up from underground cracks. The people who built here almost certainly knew about it, and likely treated it as significant. Trade goods from as far as central Mexico have been found among the ruins, suggesting this wasn't an isolated outpost, but a busy stop on a much longer network. But not every force on this plateau worked with human intention. At Goosenecks State Park, the land itself trapped a river into the most inefficient path imaginable and has never let it go. It's called an entrenched meander, formed when a river was already winding slowly across flat ground, as the plateau rose underneath it, too gradually for the water to cut a new path. so it now travels 6 miles of water to cover just 1 mile of ground. The canyon it pressed into sits over 1,000 feet from rim to floor, with the river still visible at the bottom, still locked into that same shape. Geologists call it one of the clearest examples of this formation anywhere, which is a polite way of saying the river completely failed at taking a shortcut. From the overlook, the bends sit so far below and so tightly coiled they look less like geology and more like something someone dropped from a great height. Below all of that, the San Juan River carries one of the heaviest sediment loads of any river in the region. That sediment runs red-brown year-round, loaded with uranium and other minerals worn from the plateau above. It sounds crazy, but the silt load is so heavy that in certain stretches, the water is closer to liquid mud than anything resembling a clear stream. Flash floods here need no warning. Levels can rise 20 feet in under an hour, with nothing visible at canyon floor level until it's already happening. For the Navajo people, the river has long marked more than a physical boundary. It separates territories and carries cultural meaning that no map has ever captured. That invisible weight carries into Canyon de Chelly, where the same land has been continuously cultivated, contested, and occupied for well over 1,000 years. Unlike most protected sites, people still live and farm inside it, the same way families have for generations. The walls rise so high that old stone dwellings pressed into the cliff faces look unreachable from below, and yet people got up there and lived. Those dwellings weren't sealed when people left. Tools and household items were still in place when researchers first documented them. Federal ownership stops here, since the Navajo people retain full ownership and co-manage the site. No visitor can enter the canyon floor without a Navajo guide, partly for cultural reasons, partly because the terrain is disorienting and has claimed lives. Rising from the canyon floor nearby, Spider Rock stands completely apart. A single sandstone spire so isolated it looks less like geology and more like something left behind on purpose. It rises straight up from the canyon floor, not attached to any wall, just standing alone on open ground. According to Navajo tradition, it is home to Spider Woman, a powerful figure who taught the Navajo people how to weave. Misbehaving children were warned she would carry them to the top, and the bleached white tip was said to be the bones of children taken there. That story kept the spire off limits for climbing, so it remains one of the few formations in the canyon never touched by outside hands. Not far along the same wall, something built by human hands tells an equally unlikely story at the White House ruin. No clear path leads up to it, Yet people lived there for centuries as a fully functioning home. The name itself comes from the white plaster that still coats part of the upper section, visible from the canyon floor below. It was never fully abandoned. Successive groups kept using the site long after the original builders had gone. Further along the same wall, Massacre Cave carries a much darker story, a violent conflict that left a mark on Navajo memory that has never faded. During a Spanish military raid, the women, elders and children who took shelter inside were killed where they hid. The Navajo name translates roughly to "two fell off." 2 soldiers went over the edge during the attack, a detail the Spanish accounts left out entirely. Sadly, the Spanish records framed the event as a military success. At coral pink sand dunes, the ground itself is always moving, and nothing stays in the same place for long. The sand here gets its colour from nearby Navajo sandstone. The iron oxide in the rock gives it that warm, coral pink tone that looks almost too vivid to be real. The park sits in a natural wind funnel between 2 rock formations, which is exactly why dunes formed here and why they never stop moving. They shift constantly, sometimes burying plants overnight and uncovering them again weeks later as the sand rolls through. Surface temperatures can reach over 140 degrees Fahrenheit on a summer afternoon, hot enough to burn skin on contact. You wouldn't expect it, but that same scorching sand supports a small community of insects and plants found almost nowhere else. One of them is a beetle tied almost entirely to this specific patch of ground. The coral pink sand dunes tiger beetle, a species whose whole world is measured in just a few acres. It hunts by sprinting across the surface at speeds that, relative to its body size, would outpace a cheetah, then stops, recalibrates, and charges again. Its pale colouring matches the pink sand almost exactly, keeping it hidden from both prey and predators at once. Its larvae are equally aggressive. They dig vertical burrows in the sand and wait just below the surface, lunging at anything that crosses the entrance. That trick of hiding the real threat just below the surface doesn't belong to the beetle alone. Pariah Canyon's name comes from the Paiute word for muddy water, a warning, not a description. The canyon floor looks solid, but it isn't. Quicksand appears without warning, looking identical to the regular mud that covers most of the ground, and hikers have sunk through it mid-step. Flash floods here don't need a storm overhead. Rain falling miles away drains straight in, and the water can travel the length of the canyon, carrying hikers with it. In one real incident, 2 hikers were swept miles downstream and killed. Rescuers found a survivor only because an infrared camera on a helicopter picked up body heat through the flood debris. In some sections, the walls close in so tight You can touch both sides at once, which means there's no way to climb out. When water comes, you go with it. People have lived and travelled through this canyon for over 2,000 years, using it as a route rather than a home, for obvious reasons. Where the canyon finally opens, the Colorado River takes over, and at Horseshoe Bend, it makes a turn so tight and complete, it almost loops back on itself. The viewpoint sits 1,000 feet above the river, and there's no fence between the edge and the drop. The river loops so sharply back on itself that the land in the middle of the bend is nearly an island, connected to surrounding rock by just a narrow strip. That loop exists because the Colorado once flowed across flat ground, meandering slowly. Then the land rose, the river couldn't change course, and it cut straight down, locking the old bend in place. People fall here every year. Some step past the safety railing for a better photo, and in more than one case, witnesses watched it happen in real time. Visitation jumped from around 100,000 people a year to over 2 million in under a decade, driven almost entirely by a single photo that spread online. At the rim, rock squirrels have figured all of this out. They work the crowds with the patience of seasoned professionals, and they bite. They look harmless enough, about the size of a small cat, and tourists instinctively reach out to feed them, but that's a big mistake. They carry plague bacteria, and bites at canyon viewpoints have sent people to the hospital. What's strange is that they're not actually social animals. Males are territorial and will fight each other seriously. But around humans, they drop all of that and operate as solo opportunists. The Navajo have always read this canyon terrain more carefully than any squirrel. At Antelope Canyon, just down the road, they control all access, and without a licensed Navajo guide, nobody gets in. That rule came directly from tragedy. A flash flood once sent a wall of water through the passage, with no warning, killing 11 tourists. The storm that caused it had broken miles away, completely out of sight. The sole survivor was the guide, found battered and stripped of his clothing by the force of the water. Today, Navajo guides track weather across the entire watershed before each tour enters, not just the sky overhead. The famous light beams only appear for a few weeks each year, when the sun angle is steep enough to shoot straight down through the ceiling slots. Outside that window, they simply don't exist. Not everything inside those walls is visible. A canyon wren has made the stone passages as its own, and its call, dropping in pitch like a scale played in reverse, travels through the rock long before the bird is even spotted. Barely larger than a golf ball, it calls through stone passages with surprising force. That descending whistle isn't decorative. Males use it to claim territory, letting the canyon walls project it in every direction at once. What's strange is they never drink water directly. Every drop of moisture they need comes from spiders and insects pulled from rock crevices. The Green River works on a very different scale. It runs 730 miles before joining the Colorado, passing through country so remote that early explorers didn't know what was waiting around the next bend. One expedition lost boats, ran out of food, and had crew members quit on foot through the desert rather than continue on the water. Along its banks sits a cold water geyser shooting up to 100 feet, not from volcanic heat, but from an abandoned oil well that accidentally pierced a pressurized pocket of carbon dioxide underground. It still erupts unannounced, coating surrounding rock in orange mineral deposits. Decades ago, tamarisk trees were planted along the banks to control erosion. They worked too well, consuming so much water that native plants along the river have nearly disappeared. On the calmer, wider sections, the river draws a bird. Most people don't expect to find this far from the coast, the American white pelican. It has a 9-foot wingspan, yet it never dives for fish the way most people expect. Systems like this one sit along major flyways, pulling birds down from thousands of miles away. Groups fan out across the water in a coordinated line, herding fish into the shallows before scooping them up together. You wouldn't expect it, but that famous pouch never stores food. They drain the water instantly and swallow on the spot. During breeding season, a strange horn-like plate grows on top of the bill. Once eggs are laid, it falls off and never grows back. Some birds travel over 1,000 miles between nesting and wintering grounds, routing through desert river systems like this one. Not everything follows the seasons, and the beaver works alone, year-round, and builds to last. It doesn't just live beside the river, it rebuilds it, felling trees and packing mud to raise water levels high enough to surround its lodge on all sides. There's no door on land. The only way in is through an underwater tunnel, keeping every predator locked out. Those front teeth never stop growing. Constant gnawing is the only thing that keeps them from curling back into the jaw. They're also naturally orange, coated in iron-rich enamel that makes them harder than a human tooth. It sounds crazy, but a single beaver pond can increase the number of plant species in an area by up to 33%. Beaver wetlands also act as natural fire breaks. The saturated ground around a pond can stop a wildfire from crossing dry desert terrain. While the beaver builds with water, the desert ahead holds something far stranger. Trees turned entirely to stone in what is now Petrified Forest National Park. The logs scattered across the park floor aren't wood anymore. Volcanic ash buried the trees, silica seeped in, and replaced every cell with solid quartz. The colours inside each log, red, purple, yellow, come from trace minerals locked in during that process, and no two logs look the same. Rangers searched vehicles on the way out. Visitors were removing roughly 12 tons of petrified wood every year, and the park was quietly disappearing piece by piece. Hundreds of stolen pieces have since been mailed back, many with apology letters describing job losses, injuries and broken relationships that began right after the theft. Locals call it the curse of the petrified forest. The park also uncovers new dinosaur species 2 or 3 times a year, making it one of the most active fossil discovery sites in North America. Just past the logs, the ground gives way to bare rock, worn down to its mineral core, exposing the red, pink and purple layers of the painted desert. The colours here aren't actually painted. They're mineral stains baked into layers of soft mudstone and ash. Rain changes them in real time. Water pulls oxygen from iron-rich rock, turning red patches into shades of grey and lavender right before a storm. At sunrise and sunset, those same layers go dramatically darker as low-angle light hits at a different angle. No filter needed. Buried in the rock are fossilised sand dunes, still holding the footprints of reptiles that crossed them before any dinosaur walked this region. One heavy monsoon can strip away enough material to expose fossils that were completely buried the season before. That same restless erosion pushed the terrain further north, where the ground folded, cracked, and buckled into the cliffs and domes of Capitol Reef National Park. Early settlers called this place a bad place to lose a cow. The cliffs blocked travel so completely that pioneers compared crossing them to a coral reef at sea, which is exactly where the name comes from. White sandstone domes above those cliffs reminded settlers of Capitol building domes back east, and the name stuck. Inside the park sits a working orchard. Over 2,000 fruit trees planted by Mormon settlers, still producing, and still open for visitors to pick from in season. Long before any settler arrived, the Fremont people left petroglyphs on the canyon walls here. Researchers still disagree on what many of them mean. Flash floods tear through these canyons with almost no warning, and potholes worn into the rock can hold water for months after a single storm. All of it, the orchards, the floods, the cliffs, the petroglyphs, sits along the water pocket fold, a 100-mile buckle, in the Earth's crust that defines everything inside this park. The name is surprisingly literal, as rain pools in natural basins worn into the rock surface, creating water pockets that animals rely on long after storms pass. One side of the fold sits roughly 7,000 feet higher than the other, and that drop happens fast. Red and green-grey rock layers run side by side here. Red formed in dry air and green formed underwater, but both ended up in the same fold. Those pale sandstone domes rising above it all are what gave the park its other name. Capitol Dome reminded settlers so strongly of a government building that they used it to name the whole region. It isn't actually a dome, it's a series of rock fins that only look rounded from a distance, and up close the shape falls apart completely. The white sandstone making up those domes was once a Sahara-scale field of sand dunes. Those dunes still show their original wind patterns inside the rock, diagonal lines that geologists use to figure out which direction the desert winds once blew. Not far below that surface, those same rock layers drop into Grand Wash. It narrows to about 16 feet wide at its tightest, with walls rising on both sides until the sky is just a thin line overhead. In 2022, a flash flood swept through with almost no warning. 3 cars were dragged down the canyon and 50 visitors had to be airlifted out. Less than half an inch of rain falling miles away is enough to trigger that. The canyon has nowhere for the water to go, but straight through, and fast. Butch Cassidy reportedly used Grand Wash as a hideout. An arch above still carries his name, and anchor holes he reportedly used are still visible in the rock. Mormon settlers who arrived later weren't hiding. They were planting, turning this same terrain into Fruita, a working farm that no one expected to find out here. It has nearly 2,000 fruit trees still producing today, and visitors can pick and eat them on the spot, which almost no national park allows. Most varieties here are heirloom types that have disappeared from commercial farming. The park is quietly keeping fruits alive that barely exist anywhere else. One family raised 11 children in the Bahunin cabin, a single-room stone structure so small it barely looks like it fits 2 adults. Long before the settlers arrived, others had already marked these cliffs, and the carvings they left on the sandstone walls above Fruita are what lead to the petroglyph panels. The figures pressed into these cliff faces were made by the Fremont people, a culture that lived here for roughly 700 years before completely vanishing, with no clear explanation for where they went. Some human-like figures wear elaborate headdresses, necklaces, and ear ornaments, suggesting the panels serve something far more ceremonial than simple record-keeping. A rock slide in 1952 dislodged part of the cliff face, taking some figures down with it, and what's visible today survived by chance. No one fully agrees on what the imagery means. Researchers have debated it for decades without consensus. In 2016, vandals scratched Dallas, Texas, directly onto one of the panels. The reward offered for information topped out at $500. The animals shown, bighorn sheep, deer, snakes, are all still present in the park, which makes the panels a surprisingly accurate wildlife record. One of those animals, the gopher snake, still moves through the same canyon floors below. It's not venomous, but has convinced most of the desert otherwise. When threatened, it flattens its head, hisses through a specialised organ, and vibrates its tail against dry leaves to sound exactly like a rattlesnake. It even strikes with its mouth closed, hitting with its nose. All bluff, no venom, but effective enough to send most predators running. When it's not performing, it's hunting. Rodents, lizards, and small birds are all fair game, killed by constriction rather than poison. Females lay eggs and leave immediately, and the hatchlings receive no care, no guidance, becoming fully independent from their first breath. That same self-reliance plays out across a much bigger stage at Canyonlands, where two rivers have been cutting through rock for so long, the result looks less like a park and more like a planet. With no developed access or rescue coverage, people die there every year, usually from heat exhaustion before anyone realises they're missing. Butch Cassidy used the southern canyons the same way he used Grand Wash, as a hideout after robberies, knowing the land was so disorienting that most lawmen refused to follow. Where the Colorado River and the Green River meet, the two flows run side by side in visibly different colours before finally mixing, something few visitors actually expect to see. The park also holds dinosaur swim tracks, not footprints, but impressions left by dinosaurs paddling through shallow water, pressed into rock that hardened around them. Much of the ground is covered in biological soil crust, a living layer so fragile that a single footprint can take over a century to recover, and most visitors walk right across it. And to understand the full scale of what the river's built here, there's only one place to go, and it's called the Island in the Sky. The mesa sits high above the canyon floor on all sides, with a single narrow road as the only way in or out. Near the edge sits upheaval dome, and scientists still can't agree whether a salt dome pushed it up from below or a meteorite punched it in from above. Despite the drop-off on nearly every side, the mesa top is flat enough to drive across. It feels less like a cliff, and more like a table with the legs kicked out. Below it, the desert floor breaks into hundreds of narrow rock spires at the needles. From the mesa's edge, the spires look impossibly packed. Up close, each column stands separate, striped in alternating bands of red and white sandstone. A layer of salt buried 1,000 feet underground flows under pressure, slowly fracturing the sandstone above. That's what actually built the needles, not wind or rain, as others might think. Despite sharing a park, the Needles and Island in the Sky have no direct road between them, and getting from one to the other means driving nearly 100 miles around. That kind of remoteness is just a warm-up for what lies at the maze, where even experienced rangers have gotten turned around for days. It covers 30 square miles with almost no marked trails. Rangers working there check in on a schedule, because a missed call-in means something went wrong. GPS tells you where you are, but not which way the rock drops off. A single rainstorm can turn the only access road into mud for days, and water sources inside can dry up without warning. Park staff have stated openly that fast rescue here is not guaranteed, which makes Mesa Arch feel like a completely different world. Every sunrise, photographers line up in the dark to claim one of only about 20 tripod spots along the rim. In summer, some arrive 3 hours early just to get a position. What's strange is the arch is never truly still. Scientists have recorded its natural vibration frequency, a low hum used to track whether the rock is slowly weakening. Once the crowds leave and temperatures drop, the desert shifts. The kangaroo rat has mastered these conditions better than almost anything else out here. It never drinks water, pulling all the moisture it needs from dry seeds through a chemical process inside its own body. Its kidneys produce urine 4 times more concentrated than a human's, losing almost nothing. Owls hunt it by sound alone, so it evolved oversized ear chambers to detect the faintest wing movement before it arrives. Those powerful hind legs can launch it sideways mid-air, a split-second redirect that leaves most predators grabbing nothing. Above all of this, the canyon holds a different kind of scale, at the Dead Horse Point. The name comes from a real incident. Cowboys once used the narrow mesa tip as a natural corral for wild mustangs, then accidentally left a group stranded there. The horses died of thirst with the Colorado River visible far below, close enough to see, completely out of reach. Stranger still, the view from the rim today includes electric blue ponds glowing in the red rock below. Industrial evaporation pools used to mine potash, dyed blue on purpose to absorb more heat. Here, the mountain lion moves with such a strategy that no operation has ever managed to track. A single one holds a territory of up to 150 square miles, patrolling it mostly at night and rarely using the same route twice. After a kill, it buries the carcass and returns to feed from it for up to a week. You wouldn't expect it, but the cat will abandon a cached kill entirely if it detects a human has been nearby. It simply walks off and starts hunting again. Kittens are born spotted, which keeps them hidden while the mother hunts alone. Those spots fade completely as they grow, replaced by the solid coat that makes adults nearly invisible against canyon rock. A mother raises her cubs with no partner and no help, teaching them to hunt over nearly 2 years before they go off on their own. Not everything out here has to hide. The Corona Arch sits fully in the open to make sure it is seen. It was once called Little Rainbow Bridge, a peaceful name that didn't survive what came next. A rope swing rigged through the opening went viral online, and people came from everywhere to try it. One man miscalculated the rope length, swung under the arch, hit the ground, and unfortunately didn't survive. Rope swinging was banned for commercial operators shortly after, but private visitors kept coming, and another serious accident followed within the year. Sitting out in open public land, with no entry fee and no ranger station, the arch had no real way to stop anyone. Just up the trail, Bowtie Arch formed in a completely different way, not by erosion pushing through from the side, but by a hole worn straight down from above. Water pooled on top of a cliff and slowly ate straight down until it punched through the rock below. The result looks less like an arch and more like a skylight in the ceiling. It stands right beside Corona Arch but gets almost no attention, mostly because it didn't end up in any viral videos. Water still seeps through the opening, feeding a narrow strip of hanging plants on an otherwise bare cliff face. The same slow erosion in Goblin Valley has left behind thousands of squat, knob-headed figures covering an entire valley floor. They're packed into a single open bowl, a density so high it looks less like a desert and more like a crowd that forgot to leave. Two scout leaders once filmed themselves pushing one over, claiming it was a safety hazard. The video went viral. The public reacted furiously, and both men faced criminal charges, all for knocking over a rock. The formations are unusually fragile because the soft sandstone underneath erodes faster than the harder cap on top, leaving each one balanced on a shrinking base. NASA has used the valley to test Mars rover equipment, and it's easy to see why. The surface looks more like another planet than a state park. Not every remarkable rock formation can be walked up to freely. The wave sitting inside a protected Arizona wilderness lets in only 64 people per day, and getting a permit can take years. Visitors here navigate entirely by compass and printed coordinates. Entry runs through a lottery that draws over 200,000 applicants a year. In peak months, the odds of winning drop to around 2%. Some people enter for years without getting in. The rock itself is surprisingly fragile. The swirling layers are soft enough to crumble underfoot, which is part of why access is so tightly controlled. Flash floods are the other reason. The canyon sits in a drainage zone where storms miles away can send a wall of water through with almost no warning. In the 1990s, there was no permit system at all. Visitors came and went freely until the damage to the fragile surface became impossible to ignore. Coyote Butte South runs under the same permit system, but almost nobody talks about it, which makes getting in considerably easier. Coyote Butte South uses the same permit system as the Wave, but allows 20 people per day instead of 64. And because far fewer people know about it, permits here are actually attainable. Getting there is a separate challenge because the access roads cut through loose sand and sharp rock, and a standard four-wheel drive often isn't enough. Pottery fragments and stone tools left by Pueblo and peoples have been found scattered across the rock, untouched and unguarded. Factory Butte has no permit system, no lottery, and no limit on who can enter, yet the terrain itself does most of the work of keeping people out. The pale grey rock underfoot is marine shale, left behind when an inland ocean covered most of Utah around 90 million years ago. That soft shale erodes so fast that the slopes visibly change shape from one season to the next, and the ground turns into a near impassable slick after rain. Early settlers named it after the Provo woolen mill. Back east, its flat-topped, multi-tiered silhouette looked exactly like a factory building rising from the flats. For years, the area around it was legally closed to off-road vehicles to protect two endangered plant species found nowhere else in the region. The closure was lifted without public notice or environmental review, opening 5,400 acres overnight. And conservation groups took the government to court over it. White Pocket sits within the same protected boundaries, but what's happening to the rock there has nothing to do with shale. The rock here doesn't sit in layers like most sandstone. It folds and wrinkles in on itself, as if something squeezed it from below before it had the chance to harden. That's essentially what happened. The Navajo sandstone was still partially unstable when it was buried, and the pressure from sediment above pushed it into those contortions permanently. The red and white swirls within the same formation aren't two different rock types. They're the same sandstone at different stages of oxidation, split by how much oxygen reached each section during burial. Getting there requires navigating roughly 25 miles of unmarked sand track, where even experienced drivers get stuck, and the site itself offers no infrastructure of any kind once you arrive. because the access route keeps most visitors out. The formations here look almost exactly as they did before anyone gave them a name. The rock at White Pocket recorded nothing but its own geology, while El Morro recorded everyone who ever passed it, going back 1,000 years. A single sandstone bluff there holds over 2,000 messages pressed directly into its base, left by ancestral Puebloans, Spanish conquistadors, and US Army surveyors. Every one of them stopped here for the same reason: a natural pool at the rock's base that collects snow melt and rain and has never fully dried out. One of the earliest European inscriptions was left by a Spanish conquistador in 1605, 15 years before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, and it was written right after he massacred an entire Pueblo. Grand Staircase Escalante keeps no such record of human passage, because the land was simply too remote for anyone to linger long enough to leave one. It covers nearly 1.9 million acres, most of it completely off the grid, and few protected areas in the country are this genuinely hard to reach. The rock underfoot preserves a near-complete window into prehistoric life. At least 15 dinosaur species pulled from the ground here exist nowhere else, including a tyrannosaur spotted by a ranger who noticed loose bones on a hillside. Paleontologists also found tiny fossilised dinosaur eggs here, preserved by the ground's slightly alkaline chemistry in a way that almost never happens elsewhere. Scattered across the same ground are thousands of small iron-coated spheres called Moki marbles. They closely resemble formations found on Mars, and their origin is still genuinely debated. When the monument's protected boundaries were cut, scientists pointed out that the removed sections held some of the densest fossil deposits on the plateau, now with no legal protection. A place that holds that much still underground is not one to rush through. And Lower Calf Creek Falls, just inside the monument's edge, rewards the people who don't. The falls drop 126 feet into a pool fed by water that filters down through sandstone rather than collecting from rain, which is why it runs year-round, even when the surrounding desert gets almost no rainfall. Along the trail, Fremont people built small stone granaries directly into the canyon walls to store food, and some of them are still standing. The canyon walls above are streaked with desert varnish, a dark mineral coating that forms over thousands of years and was used by those same people as a writing surface for petroglyphs. What has shaped this canyon more than any other feature here is the river below it, and the Escalante's reach goes far beyond what the trail reveals. The Escalante River was the last major river in the contiguous US to be formally mapped, and even then, fully charting its canyon arms took 6 years to complete. During peak runoff, the flow can surge to 100 times its normal level without warning, long before rain reaches the canyon floor. One of its side canyons feeds in quietly from the north and holds more geological contrast in 2 miles than most parks manage in 100. A year-round creek runs through Coyote Gulch's desert sandstone, and the water barely reaches ankle height in most places, yet it has cut a canyon nearly 900 feet deep in some sections. Jacob Hamblin Arch spans so wide that a single photo can't capture its full frame, fed by a spring. Directly below, that runs regardless of rainfall. Coyote Natural Bridge looks almost identical, but formed differently. Instead of a hole wearing through from above, the creek cuts straight through the base of a rock fin from below. Hikers getting lost here is a documented problem, as the canyon's bends and nearly identical sandstone walls have led to fatalities, and even experienced groups have needed rescue. The canyon eventually pinches down so tight that packs have to come off to squeeze through, and that's exactly where Spooky Gulch begins. At its tightest point, the wall's close to just 10 inches, so after multiple hikers got physically wedged inside, rangers installed 2 vertical measuring poles at the trailhead as a body width test before entry. Once, a man spent 9 hours stuck in the rock before rescuers could pull him free. Even in full daylight, almost no sunlight reaches the canyon floor, leaving it in near darkness at midday, which is exactly how it got its name. Where Spooky closes in straight and blind, Peekaboo takes the opposite approach, curling into wide spiralling chambers that act more like rooms than a corridor. The entrance requires a 10-foot climb up footholds pressed into the wall, the same steps that have been in use for roughly 800 years, left there by the people who came before any tourist ever did. Recent flash floods pushed boulders inside, creating sudden drop-offs mid-canyon with no warning markers of any kind. Not far from the canyon exit, the scrub flats are home to one of the desert's most self-sufficient residents, the striped skunk, which can go without a permanent water source in terrain that would leave most animals stranded. They're immune to yellow jacket venom, so a skunk will dig into an underground nest, stomp on the wasps as they swarm out, and eat them one by one. Each skunk carries roughly 1 tablespoon of musk total, enough for about 5 sprays before it runs completely dry, which takes 10 days to reload. A direct hit to the eyes causes temporary blindness, and the smell carries over a mile downwind. Great horned owls hunt skunks regularly, but not because they're fearless. They simply have almost no sense of smell, and the spray doesn't register. Red Canyon stone runs so deeply red it looks almost artificial, and the hoodoos standing along the road make it feel like a place built for a film set. The red colour here doesn't come from sandstone. It comes from the Claren Formation, an iron-rich limestone built up over 25 million years inside an ancient lake system that repeatedly dried out and refilled. That same rock sits on the Sevier fault line, where one side of the plateau was pushed up over 8,000 feet, while the other stayed low, putting Red Canyon at a strange middle elevation, too high for desert, too dry for forest. Ponderosa pines grow right alongside the red hoodoos here, a combination that looks almost wrong, like 2 completely different places got stitched together. The hoodoos here are softer and more fragile than those at Bryce Canyon. which is why the formations closest to the road show visible erosion that the ones further back don't. Most people speed through on the way to Bryce Canyon without stopping, which means the Hoodoos here, standing right at road level, get far less foot traffic than formations half as dramatic elsewhere. That road, Scenic Byway 12, continues threading past the canyon boundary, keeping the red walls close for miles ahead. It was never supposed to be easy to drive. The route was forced through two solid, rock walls by hand using horse-drawn equipment, and when it finally opened in 1925, a 315-car caravan drove through to celebrate. The park's opening ceremony was held right in front of one of those tunnels, so a hand-drilled rock passage is technically how the park was introduced to the public. The clearance is just 13.5 feet, and it still catches drivers off guard. Tall RVs clip the ceiling regularly, and the scrape marks are still there on the rock. The arch openings were designed just wide enough for a single lane of traffic, which is why modern vehicles still have to slow to a near stop and commit to the angle before they can see through to the other side. The road keeps getting less forgiving the further it goes, which is exactly the kind of pressure that leads to places like Buckskin Gulch, where the walls press in from both sides and the sky disappears entirely. It runs for 16 miles of unbroken narrows, the longest continuous slot canyon in North America, and for most of that distance, the walls are just wide enough to walk through sideways. There is only one exit point along the entire route, roughly 8 miles in, and if water rises before hikers reach it, the walls offer no way out. The danger doesn't start here, as storms on the plateau miles away funnel directly into this corridor, and water can rise 20 feet with no warning at all. In a single spring, 4 hikers drowned in 2 separate flash flood events just weeks apart, with one body found miles past the Utah-Arizona border. A survivor from one of those groups was only found after rescuers spotted floating debris from the air and followed it to him. After conditions this confined, the contrast ahead is immediate, because Kaibab National Forest sits at a completely different elevation, where pine trees replace sandstone and the air changes entirely. That elevation difference is the whole story. The same plateau that borders the Grand Canyon sits high enough to be covered in ponderosa pine rather than rock and sand. It forms part of the largest contiguous ponderosa pine forest in the country, yet it's completely cut off from similar forests by desert and canyon walls on all sides. That isolation turned it into a living experiment in what happens when a population has nowhere to go, and the most dramatic example came from the deer. Government hunters wiped out nearly all the plateau's predators to protect those deer, and the population exploded from around 4,000 to an estimated 100,000 in less than 2 decades. By the time anyone intervened, the deer had stripped the forest bare and were dying of starvation by the thousands, leaving the plateau worse off than before the predators were removed. That same cut-off environment also produced something found nowhere else, the kaibab squirrel, a subspecies that evolved right here among the pines. It lives within a roughly 20 by 40 mile patch of ponderosa pine on the North Rim Plateau. And because the Grand Canyon cuts it off from every related population, it has been evolving in isolation ever since. It survives winter without hibernating, foraging every day through snow on pine bark, seeds, and underground truffles that no other squirrel in the region relies on. That kind of tight dependency points to what waits at the next stop, where scale and isolation take on an entirely different meaning. The canyon walls here at Zion National Park are built from compressed sand dunes, not ocean sediment, like most canyon parks, which is why the sandstone holds those sharp, vertical faces instead of sloping away. The Virgin River cut through over 2,000 feet of solid rock by carrying sand and gravel that grinds the canyon floor lower year by year. It sounds crazy, but a massive rock slide once dammed the entire canyon and flooded it into a lake that sat for roughly 700 years before the natural dam eroded away. Indigenous communities lived in this canyon long before outside settlers arrived, and the name those settlers gave it, Zion, comes from Hebrew, meaning a place of sanctuary. Today it pulls nearly 5 million visitors a year, yet most never leave the main valley floor, leaving the upper section almost entirely empty, including the area where 2 hikers died within 5 days of each other. The river that caused all of this is also what leads into the park's most extreme passage, the Narrows. There's no path, no walkway, just the Virgin River running between walls 1,000 feet tall and sometimes only 20 feet wide. A flash flood can surge through with no warning, even under a clear sky, because the storm driving it may be miles upstream. And once the surge hits hard enough to move a grown adult off their feet, the Park Service shuts the entire Narrows down. Rangers have responded to fatalities from hikers already deep inside when closures were triggered too late to evacuate. On top of that, the Virgin River periodically develops toxic algae blooms, meaning the water surrounding hikers can become a health hazard that has nothing to do with current or rock. From down at river level, the walls press in from every side, but the vantage point showing the full scale of this canyon sits high above it on Angel's Landing. A minister exploring the canyon in 1916 looked up at the narrow ridge and said only an angel could land on something that thin, and the name stuck. The final half mile to the summit runs along a sandstone fin with sheer drop-offs on both sides and nothing between a hiker and open air but a chain bolted into the rock. On average, someone dies on the trail every year, and just this past April, 2 fatal falls happened within days of each other, prompting the park to close the trail for investigation. That string of deaths pushed authorities to introduce a lottery permit system, which now limits how many people can attempt the climb on any given day. What's strange is the real bottleneck isn't the drop. It's the crowd, with hikers going up and down simultaneously on a path barely wide enough for one person at a time. From the summit, the entire valley opens up below, and that view down into Zion Canyon makes the floor feel like a completely different world from everything above it. The walls press in so tightly that the floor sits in shade for most of the day, and in summer, the temperature difference between floor and rim can swing by as much as 30 degrees. Three pools sit partway up the cliff face, fed by water seeping through the sandstone, and the green colour that named them comes entirely from algae coating the pool beds year-round. You wouldn't expect it, but more visitor fatalities have occurred at those pools than at Angel's Landing, most from slipping on the wet rock at the edges rather than any dramatic height. The 3 sandstone peaks visible from the valley floor were named Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob by a Methodist minister who also named Angel's Landing and the Great White Throne in a single visit, essentially branding most of the canyon in one afternoon. The park's original name was Mukuntuweap, a southern Paiute word meaning straight canyon, and officials quietly dropped it, not for simplicity, but because they feared visitors wouldn't come if they couldn't pronounce it. At the canyon's south entrance, the Watchman served as a fixed reference point for early Mormon settlers navigating this area long before any road existed. That contrast is what makes the country to the south feel like a completely different place, where the Vermilion cliffs trade compression for space, and the red in the rock deepens considerably. The monument covers a large part of northern Arizona, most of it inaccessible without a serious off-road vehicle and working knowledge of unmarked roads. Red iron oxide baked into the sandstone gives the cliffs their colour, but streaks of blue and purple from manganese run through the same walls, and the mix shifts noticeably depending on the light. Condors were released here specifically because the thermals rising off the hot rock give young birds exactly the lift they need for their first real flights. That choice mattered. The California condor came within 23 individuals of total extinction before a recovery program pulled it back, and the Vermilion Cliffs became one of its main reintroduction sites. Some birds released here have since travelled hundreds of miles across the plateau, tracked by researchers monitoring how well the wild population holds together. What keeps the rock so exposed here is the same force that makes the San Rafael swell so unusual. Pressure from below, pushing layers up instead of letting them sit flat. a dome of rock buckled upward when tectonic forces pushed on the crust from the east. And once the top cracked open, water found every fracture and went to work. On the eastern edge, the fracturing tilted the rock layers nearly vertical, like an open book standing on end, a wall geologists call the San Rafael Reef. Rainwater pressed into those fractures over time, cutting slot canyons only a few feet wide but hundreds of feet deep into the reef. In the southwest corner, dark veins of old molten rock cut through the pale sandstone, pushed up from below long after the dome itself had already formed. Oddly, the rock record inside the swell runs almost unbroken from Permian to Cretaceous periods, a sequence fully exposed where the same layers are buried or missing almost everywhere else on the plateau. It's the San Rafael River that found the lowest fracture line through all of this, and the corridor it pressed into is where the next section begins. Running through the cracked core of the swell, it cuts progressively into older and older rock, exposing the same limestone layer that forms the rim of the Grand Canyon. The deepest section, called the Black Box, is a twin slot canyon where the walls press in so tight there are no banks to walk on. The only way through is to wade the water directly. Flash floods hit without warning here, and the walls are too sheer to climb out of, so hikers who enter during storm season are essentially betting on the weather being right. That same sudden, pressurised flooding is what hollowed out Little Wild Horse Canyon nearby. Its bare rock walls absorb no water at all, so even a light rain anywhere upstream sends a fast-moving surge through passages too tight to turn around in. A single isolated storm cell that popped up directly over the canyon killed 2 young sisters, ages 7 and 3, while the sky at the trailhead was completely clear. In September 2025, the same scenario played out again. A freak isolated storm trapped 6 hikers with nowhere to climb, and 4 more went missing. It's as close as a place can get to a trap without looking like one, and the people who chose the rock alcoves at Walnut Canyon understood that difference well. The Sinagua built their homes not on the rim or the floor, but pressed directly into the limestone walls of a 400-foot canyon. A nearby volcanic eruption is what drew them there. The ash it left behind made the surrounding soil fertile enough to farm, turning a disaster into an opportunity. In the 1880s, souvenir hunters dynamited sections of the cliff to get inside faster, destroying rooms untouched for 600 years. And that act directly triggered the first push for federal monument protection in the southwest. Over 80 dwellings were built, occupied for 125 years, then abandoned without warning. Trade goods found inside came from as far away as Central America, which makes that silence even stranger. And the same unanswered question follows into Colorado, where at Canyons of the Ancients, far more was built, and just as much was left behind. Over 30,000 archaeological sites sit packed into a single monument, with some areas containing more than 200 per square mile. Most have never been excavated, including Sand Canyon Pueblo, a 420-room village that researchers deliberately reburied after digging, just to keep looters out. Looters have been a problem for decades, and in 2020, a local man was sentenced to prison for stealing objects from a ceremonial site, part of a long pattern that has permanently stripped hundreds of undocumented sites. The river those builders once looked down on from these canyons is the same one that cuts into Arizona, and the Navajo Bridge is where that crossing becomes hard to ignore. Spanning the Colorado River at Marble Canyon, it was built to replace a ferry operated by a man later executed for his role in a massacre of over 120 settlers. His family kept the ferry running after his death until it sank on its own, right around the time the bridge was being built to replace it. Even with the bridge open, the crossing stayed dangerous. Over a 13-year period, 72 accidents happened on or approaching the bridge, and 8 of them were fatal. A second bridge was built right alongside the original in the 1990s to handle modern traffic, and the old one was converted into a pedestrian walkway. What's strange is this remains one of only 7 land crossings of the Colorado River for 750 miles. So despite having 2 bridges side by side, there's almost nothing else like it for hundreds of miles in either direction. From the walkway, the canyon walls below funnel up powerful air currents, and the California condor, with a wingspan that clears 9 feet, has learned to use them as a free ride along the cliffs. It gathers near Navajo Bridge because the Vermilion Cliffs just upstream is the exact site where the entire wild reintroduction program began, after every last one had been captured and placed in captivity. All 27 wild birds were gone from the sky at once, and the program only worked because enough survived in cages to breed back from. Condors can cover 250 miles in a single day without landing, but their biggest killer isn't distance or predators. It's lead fragments from hunters' bullets left inside carcasses, which paralyse the birds' digestive systems from the inside. It sounds crazy, but a wildlife celebrity once accidentally destroyed nearly an entire wild condor population in a single incident. And the river those birds depend on for navigation downstream is what defines the next section of canyon entirely. Scientists only recently confirmed how the Colorado River got to where it is. It likely pooled into a giant inland lake, then spilled over the plateau edge and cut the Grand Canyon as it drained. Spanish explorers originally called it the Red River because the water ran so thick with silt it turned rust-coloured. Today it barely reaches the sea. Farms and cities pull so much water along the way that the lower section now dries out before crossing into Mexico. Every state sharing it negotiated water rights based on the wettest years on record, meaning they legally divided up more water than the river actually produces in most years. It holds more than 160 rapids through the Grand Canyon alone, some powerful enough to flip a 37-foot motor raft. Solo rafters still attempt it, and some don't come back. Where the river tightens and drops into narrower rock, almost nothing follows. And in Colorado, another river does exactly that, cutting walls so close together that sunlight only reaches the bottom for a few minutes a day. The Black Canyon earns its name because the dark, metamorphic rock lining its walls absorbs so much light that even direct afternoon sun barely brightens the interior. At its narrowest point, the walls close to less than the width of a city road. The Gunnison River drops 6 times steeper through this canyon than the Colorado does through the Grand Canyon. Across the painted wall, the tallest cliff face in Colorado, white veins of molten rock run through the dark stone. Not painted, but pressed up from below under enormous heat and pressure. No human group ever lived inside the canyon itself. For 9,000 years of human presence in the region, only the rims show signs of occupation, because the gorge below was simply too hostile. The forces that pushed molten rock through the painted wall have been building land masses across the entire southwest, and in New Mexico, the evidence is still sitting on the surface. El Malpais sits on top of at least 15 overlapping lava flows, the oldest reaching back 700,000 years, and the youngest laid down just 3,000 years ago. Spanish explorers took one look at the black rock blanketing the floor and called it El Malpais, or the Badlands, deciding it was good for nothing. They were wrong, because underneath all that rock runs one of the longest lava tube systems in the world, and several of those tubes hold ice year-round, even in the middle of the New Mexico desert. The Acoma Pueblo people knew this for centuries, using the cold underground tubes for shelter, long before anyone else thought to look below the surface. NASA researchers now use the McCarty's lava flow here to understand how old volcanic eruptions worked on Mars, because the rock formation matches what orbiters and rovers have detected on the Martian surface. It's one of the few places on Earth where the ground doubles as a training manual for another planet. Just to the west in Arizona, the same volcanic story plays out again, but this time the eruption left an entire mountain of cinder behind. Sunset Crater is one of the youngest volcanoes in the continental US, and its eruption happened close enough that the people farming at its base watched it happen and survived to tell their descendants about it. The eruption buried homes and torched crops, forcing an entire population to abandon the area. But within a few decades, people came back, because the volcanic ash turned out to hold moisture better than the surrounding desert soil. The crater gets its name not from the eruption itself, but from the ring of orange and red minerals around the summit, which catch the light in a way that makes the cone look permanently lit from inside. In 1928, a Hollywood film crew arrived with the explosives, planning to blast the crater open to film a fake landslide for a movie, and local residents stopped them. That public outrage pushed the government to designate the crater a national monument the following year. Proof that when one person refuses to let a place be destroyed, the rules sometimes change. That same stubbornness, it turns out, is exactly what saved the canyon country further north. Colorado National Monument exists almost entirely because of one man who showed up in 1906, started building trails by himself, and wrote so many letters to Washington that the government eventually gave in. When it was finally designated a national monument, he was appointed its first official caretaker, paid $1 a month. Every 4th of July, he climbed Independence Monument, a 450-foot freestanding sandstone pillar, and planted an American flag on top by hand. The road that runs along the canyon rim was his idea from the start, but it took nearly 40 years, and 9 construction workers killed in a tunnel collapse to complete it. Dinosaur fossils and petrified logs have also been found here, since the same erosion that exposed the canyon walls kept pulling older material up to the surface. What he built his trails through is just the edge of something far larger. A few hours south, the Colorado Plateau drops away into the biggest canyon system on the continent. The Grand Canyon holds one of geology's most frustrating mysteries, a gap in the rock record where over 1 billion years of Earth's history simply doesn't exist. No erosion, no explanation, just missing time pressed between 2 layers of stone. Geologists call it the Great Unconformity, and after decades of study, nobody has fully agreed on what caused it. At the canyon floor there is a village called Wupatki that can only be reached by foot, mule, or helicopter. The mail is still delivered by mule train, making it the last place in the country where that still happens. The canyon also has its own rattlesnake, found nowhere else, that evolved a colouring precisely matching the reddish rock walls. A meteor impact 56,000 years ago, the one that created Meteor Crater in Arizona, likely triggered a massive landslide 100 miles away inside the canyon, damming the Colorado River and creating a lake nearly 300 feet deep. That lake is long gone, but researchers found driftwood from it, lodged in caves high above the current river level. The only way it could have gotten there. In 1956, 2 passenger planes collided over the canyon, killing 128 people, and that crash led directly to the creation of the FAA and the entire modern air traffic control system. Most people only ever see the canyon from one direction, and the South Rim is where almost all of them end up. Temperatures can swing 30 degrees between the rim and the canyon floor. Hikers have died thinking the descent was the hard part, not realising the climb back in afternoon heat is what kills them. Over 1,000 caves sit in the canyon walls, but only 335 have been recorded. Most remain closed to protect artifacts that have never been fully examined. Rock squirrels along the rim have grown so bold from tourist handouts that the park lists them as one of the most common causes of visitor injury. Below the viewpoints, the Bright Angel Trail follows a fault line the Havasupai used as a travel corridor for generations before it was ever turned into a hiking route. All of this is just the southern edge. The North Rim, sitting a full 1,000 feet higher on the opposite side, stays closed for half the year and sees only a fraction of the visitors who come here. A 1,000 feet higher than the South Rim, it receives nearly twice as much rainfall, which is why a spruce fir forest grows at its peak, something that feels completely out of place, above a desert canyon. Of the nearly 6 million people who visit the canyon each year, only 10% make it to this side, and the single access road closes under snow every winter for roughly 5 months. In the summer of 2025, a lightning-sparked wildfire tore through the North Rim and destroyed over 70 structures, including a historic lodge that had stood at the canyon edge for generations. The fire burned through ground so remote that crews couldn't reach parts of it by road, and Arizona's governor publicly demanded an investigation into why it wasn't contained sooner. Back along the southern edges, the Desert View Watchtower has stood at the rim since long before the park even existed, built specifically so people could see further than anywhere else on foot. Commissioned as a rest stop for sightseeing buses, its architect refused to make it look like one, studying ancestral Pueblo and towers across the southwest and demanding every exterior stone be hand-picked to match their original construction method. It's actually a railway bridge steel frame with carefully chosen stones stacked around it to look like it grew there naturally. Inside, the walls are covered in murals by Hopi artist Fred Cabote, including ceremonial imagery that had never been shown publicly before the tower opened. Seeing the canyon from up here is one thing, but descending into it is another. And the Bright Angel Trail drops visitors directly below the rim into a world that looks nothing like what they just left. It follows a fault line that the Havasupai used as a travel corridor for generations before it was ever turned into a hiking route. Every step down moves through roughly 60,000 years of geological time, and by the bottom, temperatures can run 20 degrees hotter than at the rim. Hikers who ignore the park's warning against making a full round trip in a single day are still rescued regularly, mostly for dehydration in heat that creeps up long before it feels dangerous. Along the West Rim, the Hualapai tribe controls the land outright and built something above it that no federal park system would have sanctioned, a glass-floored bridge hanging directly over the canyon. built on Hualapai land, a reservation covering 1 million acres along the Colorado River. It operates under the tribe's own rules: no alcohol, no firearms, and no removing so much as a rock from the ground. Built from 1.2 million pounds of steel and glass, the horseshoe-shaped bridge juts 70 feet over the rim and is rated to hold 800 people at once. Yet 2 people have gone over its edge in separate confirmed incidents. What's strange is the Hualapai name itself translates to people of the tall pines, a reminder that this tribe's territory once covered a far larger portion of forested highlands before it was reduced to canyon edge. Further into that same canyon system, on land belonging to a separate tribe entirely, a waterfall called Havasu Falls runs a shade of turquoise caused by dissolved calcium and magnesium in the water. Accessible only on foot through a 10-mile hike, every permit fee goes directly to the Havasupai community, which has controlled access here long before national park tourism existed. It drops 100 feet over a travertine cliff, a rock the water itself is building, depositing new mineral layers as it falls, slowly changing the falls over time. Flash floods have torn through the canyon more than once, rearranging the falls entirely, but the water always comes back. Pull back to the open rim above, and it's a different world, where the horned lark has found a way to live in conditions most birds avoid. It actively seeks out bare, exposed ground with almost no vegetation, exactly what the open canyon rim offers, and exactly what most other birds try to avoid. Every night it digs a small hole in the soil to sleep in, using it as shelter from the temperature swings that hit the rim after dark. Females build their nests directly on the ground, and before the eggs arrive, the bird lays a flat path of pebbles at the nest entrance. Nobody has fully explained why, but it appears in nearly every nest. What's strange is it returns to breed in the exact spot where it hatched. And because of that habit, canyon rim populations have slowly developed a slightly redder back to match the local rock. Males sing in flight, climbing high and calling on the way down, a territory announcement delivered from the sky rather than a branch, in a place that has no branches to offer. Sharp population declines have been recorded across the continent over the past 50 years, but on the open canyon rim, this small bird continues to do exactly what it has always done. This is the Colorado Plateau, a land of hidden wonders and remarkable architectural marvels. Now, if you don't want to miss the most unreal wonders of the Texas Hill Country, check out this video